It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. My name is Melody Fox Ahmed, and I'm the Associate Director for Programs here. It's good to see some familiar faces, some students. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we are a research, teaching, and outreach center located in the President's Office of Georgetown University, even though we're down here on M Street. We have courses, we have programs, we have student fellowships. This talk is actually being sponsored under the program known as Religion, Ethics, and World Affairs, which is a minor in Georgetown College and a certificate in the School of Foreign Service. So students can study these topics through an interdisciplinary array of courses. And every year we host relevant discussions with scholars who have completed recent work on interesting, relevant topics to religion and world affairs. So we're delighted to have Dr. Ken Bedell here today to present his important book, Realizing the Civil Rights Dream, which is just out. This is what it looks like, so you can know. We've also passed around a handy flyer that has a discount for you to order it. It is on Amazon. So it is really a pleasure for me on many levels to introduce Reverend Dr. Ken Bedell. He has many titles. I have known him personally for many years. We worked very closely on an initiative of the Obama administration called the President's Interfaith and Community Service Campus Challenge, which ran for the past 6 years. Ken was really a visionary leader of that at the Department of Education. So in terms of his formal bio, that's what he was most recently doing, serving the Obama administration as a senior advisor in the Office of Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships at the Department of Ed. He is also ordained in the United Methodist Church, and he led congregations for 16 years in New York, Maryland, and Ohio. He has taught from junior high to graduate school, and he has visited schools all around the world as executive secretary of the International Association of Methodist Schools, Colleges, and Universities. He has also been on the executive committee of the Religious Research Association and was founding president of the Church Computer Users Network in the mid-1980s. In addition to this book, he has written other books such as Different Ships, Same Boat, and his PhD is from Temple University. So this book, I happen to know personally, was really a labor of love for Ken, and I think he will tell us more about the process of how he came to write it, but I heard about it when it was a small seed, a small germ of an idea when he was at the Department of Education. He wasn't even sure if he would write it. He thought somebody else might, but luckily everything has converged and he has written it. I saw him here working on it at Georgetown, in the library every day for weeks, being a real student again, studying and working, and he would come and we would chat about it. And it's really, I think, a remarkable journey from inception to holding the book in our hands. When you read it, you'll read about an incident that he first encountered racism when he was 6 years old. And it's a very moving, very telling incident. So from the age of 6 until now, I think he's really been working on this book his whole life. And as Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr., who wrote the foreword to the book, describes it, in the book, Ken creates a framework to explore and explain racism in the 21st century through history, sociology, theology, and his own experiences and insights. So we look forward to learning about the book through Ken's wealth of experience and knowledge. One thing you may not know is that Ken was first a chemistry teacher. I did not know this, in Swaziland. And something that I think is very moving is that his work has always had a strong current, excuse the pun, of faith running through it. It's really guided his interest in the big questions of faith. Why has the dream of civil rights in America failed? Why are all men not equal as they are in the eyes of God, living out their equality as a God-given right in society? So I think that led him to pursue these questions. Georgetown, as many of you know, is a Catholic and Jesuit university. we're grappling here with the contradiction between our own values and our history of unjust enrichment at the expense of the enslaved. We have a working group on slavery, memory, and reconciliation, which is grappling with these issues with our history as a slave-owning institution. So that's fostering the conversation on this history and its legacy on our campus. This is a national conversation on the reality of racism in the U.S. today and how the civil rights dream can be realized. So Ken's book and this discussion is an important part of this conversation that we're having on campus and nationally. So we're really delighted to have him with us today. So thank you so much, Ken. And with that, I will turn the podium over to you.
Wow, that introduction deserved an applause, didn't it? Thank you, Melody. I'd like to start with talking about something that I didn't put in the book, but is also a piece of what Melody was talking about of my own journey and why I come to the subject of racism and civil rights in general at large from an emotional perspective, as well as what I hope is solid scholarship and intentionality. In the mid-1980s, I was a pastor in Maryland at a small rural United Methodist church. The little town was called Preston, and it was it's just outside of Easton, Maryland, that you may have heard of on the eastern shore of Maryland. It was one of the communities on the eastern shore, like I think all of the communities at that time, and maybe even to today, where there was a tremendous amount of segregation at all levels. Things like the church that I pastored had only white members. There's some stories about that too. But then there was a black United Methodist Church right on the edge of town. The fire company didn't have, although the community was about 50-50 African American and white, the fire company was segregated all white. The bank only hired white people to work in the locally owned bank. That was the context. The Klan decided to come and have an event in our community. That wasn't really local. It wasn't organized locally. There was actually some Klan members in Western Maryland who chose our community as a place to hold a Klan rally, and so they wanted as much press as they could, and were doing things with the newspaper. And the newspaper in Easton discovered that they could call me up and quote something that was on a flyer from the Klan about that they were bringing true Christianity to the Eastern Shore or something like that, and I would give them a quote about equality and that the Klan did not represent what was true Christianity, and they'd print that, and then the Klan would make some other, and they couldn't, not all of the clergy in the area were eager to talk to the newspaper, and they found out every time they called me, I answered the phone. So the Klan did all kinds of things specifically to my family. I was out visiting a parishioner in a kind of rural area. The house was quite isolated. It was in a kind of place where there's a stand of trees and a gully that went down behind the house. And I came out of the house then to leave, and KKK had been scratched in the glass in the front of the front windshield of my car. One morning I went out and there was sugar around my gas tank where somebody had opened up the gas tank and tried to pour sugar down into it. Those were kind of minor annoyances. We had threatening notes pasted to both the church door and to our house door. Get up in the morning and there was a note taped to the door. The most frightening thing that well, besides cross burnings, there was a cross burning which was pretty scary. But besides that, the really scary thing was when the phone rang at 2 in the morning, and an anonymous voice says, we know that you have 2 children. We had a kindergartner and a second grader at the time, our 2 daughters. They said, well, we know that you have 2 small children, and you certainly wouldn't want anything to happen to them, so you need to stop talking against the Klan and organizing. We ended up setting up an alternative community unity meeting at the same time that they were off burning their cross and having their rally. Threatening the safety of my children was something my wife and I dealt with in finally deciding, well, we weren't going to send the children to live with their grandparents, or we weren't going to ourselves leave town, or stop organizing the anti-Klan rally that we basically were providing some leadership to. But what I know today, as I'm standing in front of you, is that the kind of terrorism that people of color, the people that aren't white Christians, are experiencing today, I only have a memory of a sense of what that was like to feel endangered. And that there are literally millions of Americans today who are living under the threat of police brutality, that are experiencing various levels of intimidation, that know what it is on a day-to-day basis to experience little threats and small intimidations. Some of them quite intentional, and some of them from people who aren't even consciously thinking that what they're doing is being intimidating. And so what I'm going to do next is to, I hope, just really quickly run through the sociology. What I decided in my hours in the library was that the real reason we're not on top of this is because there has been, we can still, and I can still, find the anger, the disappointment, the sense that things, we can't just keep going in the same way that I felt in the 1960s when I was a college student. But that the reason we haven't been able to overcome that is because since the 1960s, there have been tremendous changes in the understanding that we have of sociology and social psychology, specifically towards how racism works and the way that it functions in society, and therefore the ways that we can identify it and begin to change it, but also, equally important, in our understanding of how societies are conservative, what keeps them the way they are, and what it takes to make changes, and important changes. And so, while in the 1960s, there was, I certainly had a sense of, this is wrong, we've got to do something about it. Now we not only can have a sense of, this is wrong, we need to do something about it, but there are ways that we can use the social sciences to make sense of what it is that's happening to us, and then to really take seriously strategizing how to make changes. So with all of that background, I want to just kind of quickly run through the arguments of the book so then we can have a discussion. Okay? I think I just push this, or do I do it down here? Okay. Okay. So the first thing that I would argue is that we've got to get our goal correct, that we got to be clear what we want to do. And that the idea, well, we're looking for equality and justice is a nice it's kind of sounds nice, but that it doesn't really help us very much, because it's hard for us to say exactly what would accomplish equality and what would even accomplish justice, although justice is a little bit easier, I think, to say what's just and what's unjust. But I would argue that, first of all, we need to see the civil rights dream as the dream that Jesse Jackson identified for us in 1988 at the Democratic Convention, where he said, the dream is for us to have not the blanket of white superiority that we have today, but a patchwork quilt nation where every group, every ethnic group has full participation. And that's something we can measure. We can look at Hollywood and say, is there full participation of all of American groups in what happens in Hollywood? We can look at higher education and say, is there really full participation? What do the faculties look like across America in higher education in terms of participation in our higher education work? What happens we can look at the members of Congress and say, do we really have full participation in our American in government? So that the first thing that I would argue, we need to be clear, our goal is that patchwork quilt, all different groups participating to make America into a patchwork quilt nation. The second thing I'd argue is that the issue often of civil rights is we need to have equal opportunity. I'd flip that around and say opportunity is not the question. The issue that we have with civil rights is that we put up barriers to some groups and some individuals. And barriers are, again, something we can identify. We can say this is a barrier. And that our goal should be that we have a nation where no person experiences greater barriers than any other person. This also is kind of the other side of the privilege piece. I would say rather than to argue against privilege, everyone should have equal privilege would be a way to say that. That there are no barriers, that everyone has the same opportunities. And obviously, if you want to become a doctor, there are barriers to that of becoming a doctor, but it shouldn't be that people of color have greater barriers, for example. So if I start with that, they say, okay, where are we? I find that the sociological categories of paradigms is a kind of way to think about where we are currently. That there are three mechanisms under the white paradigm that support racism. The first one is stereotypes. That I'm going to look at each one of these in a little more detail in a moment, but we've got stereotypes, then we've got institutional practices which support racism, and then there are disciplinary institutions which are particularly intended. The whole reason for the organization is founded on the support of the white paradigm. And then I put a circle around those in these diagrams because Anthony Giddens, I think, is a sociologist who's given us a helpful way of thinking about how we experience life as individuals, and that there's what he called a practical consciousness where we don't even think about the way things are. We just are part of institutions that have racist practices, and it's like stopping at a red light. When we come to a red light, we don't think, well, that's pretty arbitrary. Why did they choose red for stopping? I mean, it could have been purple. And we don't worry about what the consequences of going through a red light every time. We just stop. That it's part of our makeup. It's internal. It's part of our practical consciousness. When we're asked a question about it, then we can explain it. We can say why we stop at a red light, because that's the convention, because we don't want to get a ticket. We can do that. But we don't think about it at the time. And that's where the white paradigm is that it's just part of the way that we live. And then there's arrows that go from the individual practice to the white paradigm, and then arrows that are going the other way, because that's another insight that's social psychologists. And again, I think Anthony Giddens has been one of the clearest of kind of articulating how we don't, traditional Marx and Engels, or Marx and Durkheim and Weber, they kind of took us down a path of society creates the way we are, or that we're sort of victims of the society. And what these social psychologists and sociologists since the 1950s have really shifted that around to say, no, this is circular. It all mixes together. The way that we act as individuals impacts the way that society is structured. So the white paradigm is supported by our use of stereotypes every day that keeps the white paradigm strong, and then that becomes the way things are in our society, which then supports individuals, and that's what children learn then, and so on. So that's where I begin with it. This is where we are. We've got the white paradigm, but we could have a patchwork paradigm. And the patchwork paradigm, the most critical piece of this is that rather than stereotypes, which are part of a societal structure and are often structured by, it's the dominant power group that actually creates stereotypes and names them, that identity groups claim their own identity. And so someone could of course claim, I am a racist, and they could have them. There are identity groups where that's the foundation, that white people are superior, but then that would be isolated as that's their identity group, but all other identity groups would not be named by characteristics that come from the society. That there would be anti-racist institutions and institutional practices that just ultimately we would hope that those would just disappear. And finally, that institutions would be, we wouldn't have disciplinary institutions, but empowering institutions. So schools, even prisons and hospitals, and religious organizations would become empowering rather than disciplinary institutions. And the term discursive consciousness circles those institutions, because that's what social psychologists have begun to talk about. While there's the things that are just happen to us kind of without thinking, there are also those things that we think carefully about, that we reflect on. And that discursive, we don't spend a lot of time thinking about ideas and reflecting on what's the meaning of life and why are we doing this and so on. But we can, and that we need to put our institutions into a discursive mode as we move forward to become a patchwork nation. So the disciplinary institutions are schools and hospitals, not all schools, but I'll take the example, just to be bold, I'll take the KIPP schools, which are a common and somewhat popular schools that have been established across the country as charter schools. They say to black families and Hispanic families and other people of color, you send your kids to our school and we will do everything that's necessary to make sure that they get into college. That's the promise. And the way that they do that is to tell the parents and the families, you can't have anything to do with making decisions about this. You can't have any input. Many of the schools will say, well, you can't celebrate birthday parties at the school. You can't bring your other children to visit. You can't volunteer in the classroom. And then they establish a form of discipline that basically says your black culture or your Hispanic culture is going to lead you into failure, and you need to adopt this other white paradigm in order to go to college. So that's the kind of based on white values, based on practices, and there are some schools like that. They also often get government support, like the prisons are based on government support. KIPP schools are charter schools. There's often a cooperation there. And sometimes philanthropy will fall into that they really want to do good. They want to help people be successful, and successful is then defined according to the white paradigm. Racist practices in institutions are quite different. The big difference is that the racist practices are not what the organization depends on. If a grocery store only hires white managers, they're not in the business of creating white managers. They're in the business of selling groceries, and they can change that, and it doesn't really impact who they are. It's just part of the cultures and traditions of the institution, and it's practiced through discrimination and discouragement at the institutional level. And it's just coincidental. The institution can prosper perfectly well without the racist practices. And then stereotypes, just to hit this really quickly, they're dependent upon defining norms of white superiority. They're imposed rather than claimed. So when President Trump says that Puerto Ricans just want people to help them, that's imposed from the outside. That's a stereotype that is not something that's claimed by Hispanics and is not even true. And most importantly, I think it denies the gifts that can come from identity groups. So that the stereotypes, at least negative stereotypes, you can have a positive stereotype, but generally the stereotypes that impact racism deny those gifts. Well, I'd like to kind of move our discussion towards a challenge. Another piece that the social psychologists have identified is that we have in this, our consciousness, senses of a lot of things. We have senses of humor, we have senses of justice, and we can have, and do have, a certain sense of racism. And I think the challenge is for all of us to develop that sense of racism. And so that when the president says something about Puerto Ricans, it goes click, just like when somebody says something funny. We go click and we laugh. It's part of our sense of seeing the world and perceiving the world. And a part of that is to recognize that racist is really an adjective that describes actions. And so that, to go back to President Trump again, when he makes a comment that's racist, we don't say President Trump is a racist. It's helpful for all of us if we think about that action. What is it about that action that is racist, rather than to focus on the people? Because we're all going to do racist things. We're swimming in a sea of racism. We're going to be participating in racist institutions. That we need to talk about the activities, not the people. And that then this sense of racism becomes what filters what we do. So as we're closing, I hope the conversation will be somewhat about where do we go. The sociologists since the 1960s have done a whole lot of work on paradigm shifts. How do we get from white paradigm to a patchwork quilt paradigm? And some of this, just after you hear it, it just seems so logical. The first step is you identify the failures of the current paradigm. Paradigms go on until there's some recognition that things just aren't working. Then people begin to experiment. And with a new paradigm, they work out ways that can happen. And finally, as there's enough experiments and people can kind of see alternatives, then the new paradigm is claimed. So that, you've just read my book. Thank you very much. I think you're the You've read it. There's more people in this room that have read it than have read it in the whole country. So, thank you. So now Melody is going to lead us in some discussion.
So Ken, you have been a leader in interfaith movements and activism your whole life, most recently with the President's Interfaith Community Service Campus Challenge, which brought together over 400 colleges and universities to do interfaith service work on their campus and also come to Washington and share the work that they were doing around a variety of social justice issues. Historically, of course, we've seen the interfaith movement playing a major role in the civil rights movement. We saw Martin Luther King Jr., we saw Thich Nhat Hanh, we saw Rabbi Abraham Heschel standing together, marching, working for racial justice. What do you see today as the future of the interfaith movement, the racial justice, civil rights movement, working together? How are they collaborating? What's the future? What can we learn? What can the movements learn from each other? Just how do you see these two imperatives to, promote religious tolerance and racial justice working together?
I don't see any way that we can move ahead with really becoming a patchwork nation unless there are two things that happen. One is to recognize that the civil rights is not just white people and people of color, but that civil rights is an issue for all faith groups, for every ethnic group, that you can't just say Hispanic, you have to say Mexican and Guatemalan communities have different contributions to make, and that the critical piece is I want to say two. There's two critical pieces that the interfaith and the faith groups in general make. The one is kind of alluding to here is the recognition of the contributions that every faith makes to America's future, that every ethnic group makes to, and so that to look at the gifts side of it, and to help. Sometimes it even takes outsiders to recognize what's the real gift that comes from Native Americans now as we're looking at a global climate crisis, and to help build on that. And sometimes it's also important for people who are coming out of that to really identify, okay, what is it we have to give? The second piece is that we can do as much sociology as we want, and we can have whole plans for how we're going to move forward to become a nation beyond racism. But it is from the perspective of our faiths that the ultimate motivation has come. Our understanding of what ultimate reality is about is really what's at stake here. And that's it's the cooperation, the encourage, the discussion with each other, the kinds of awareness that come. Well, I'm going to stop there. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so if you have a question, please introduce yourself and state your affiliation if you're a student, what you're studying. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very nice presentation. My name is Augusto Lopez Claros. I am a visiting senior fellow from the World Bank who's spending a year at Georgetown. Talking about paradigm shifts, I'm reminding of a very interesting experiment that was done early in the previous decade, around the year 2000 and so. If you remember, that was the time when two groups of scientists, one in the United Kingdom and one here in the US, completed the mapping of the human genome. And the head of the American team, a gentleman by the name of Craig Ventier, said that one of the first questions that they wanted to answer was the question of whether the concept of race is something that had any kind of scientific underpinning. And so they said, what we did is we looked at two individuals from two completely different racial groups. I don't remember, but let's say a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Swedish and a curly-haired Nigerian. And they asked the question, what percent of the gene pool do we actually need to explain those differences between those two individuals, which we call race, right? And the answer to that question was a shocking 1/100%. In other words, these two individuals, in terms of the genetic makeup, are 99.99% the same. And what was interesting is their conclusion. Number one, race is actually a cultural concept, has nothing to do with science. There is no scientific underpinning. There is only one race, the human race. Right? And that brings, that to me is a paradigm shift. You know? And I think that much of what we see today in the world, it reflects a lack of awareness of this very fundamental scientific reality, which is that humanity is one. We're all one, right? And I think that the moment we begin to teach that in our schools, maybe we are beginning to set the foundation for the gradual elimination of racial prejudices and all the kinds of ugly things that we see around this concept.
I think that's a really good point, and it illustrates the power of the white paradigm to keep that hidden in a sense, and that I guess I don't actually know of one, but I imagine that there's a survey, because I run into people all the time who said, well, it's just natural for us to look at people and see them as different. Well, no, it's not. I mean, it's cultural. It's the social construction of reality that makes us see skin color as a distinction, which we don't see big ears and little ears as something that makes us, different species or something. I mean, it's so. I think that's such a good example of where we need to start with the identifying of where the current paradigm that puts, that assumes that genetics makes us different is one of the things that's a crack in the white paradigm, and an important one. Yeah, good. Yeah.
Hey, I'm Christopher Norris. I'm a professor of public theology at Wesley Theological Seminary here in DC. Thanks for your presentation. I think that diagnosing this in terms of the kind of three fronts of stereotypes, disciplinary institutions, and racist practices is helpful because it gets at both the kind of personal, cultural aspect of racism and white supremacy and also the institutional aspect. So with that in mind, I wonder, and I think your point about kind of breaking down barriers to give equal privilege is also helpful. But I'd like to ask you to expand on that a little bit, because I wonder if just breaking down those barriers or eliminating those barriers is enough. Because I think of racism, especially institutional racism, kind of akin to climate change, where if we, make a lot of provisions and change the way that we kind of interact with the environment now, that's helpful. But a lot of damage has already been done, almost to the point to where it's not going to be reversible. It's there. And so I wonder, with the kind of 400 years of institutional racism that's happened, is just removing barriers enough to give equal opportunity or equal privilege, or do we need to kind of rectify some of the find ways to rectify the damage that has has been done, whereas just kind of evening things out right now might not do that?
Absolutely, and that's why I don't know whether it actually speaks to that in the way that I really like to speak to it, but I think that the claim that every group would have full participation opens up, so it isn't every person for themselves, but having said that, that's sort of making excuses, because I think your point is so important. Just maybe 3 weeks ago, the Institute for Policy Studies came out with a report that they ran the statistics. Basically, they looked at past and made projections that under current policies, so they're talking about the policies that we have today, not things in the past, but under current policies, if we continue the way we are, within 35 years, by the year 2050, the median wealth of African Americans will be 0. Now, median wealth of African Americans in 35 years under current policies would be 0. That means, this is the way I think about it, is that means that if I had a grandchild born today, that white grandchild can expect to have more than $100,000 of net worth by the time they're 35. But half of the African American children that are born today, half of them can expect by the time they're 35 under current policies, half of them can expect that they will have 0 or less, that they'll be in debt basically, or have no. Now, so what that means is that it isn't just if we take away barriers in 35 years, all of this is going to be fixed, which I think is really to your point. That study then goes on to identify some of the things that are really the cause of that inequality or of causing that projection. And I think this is to your point. So we can't just say, oh, well, let's take down the barriers to getting loans for everyone, so everyone has the same chance of getting a loan. No, it takes serious, concerted, making sure that those patches are fully are up to full participation. That's so that there aren't not just the individual barriers, but that every group comes to it, and whatever name you use, restitution, intentional policies that move us towards a patchwork quilt, and which we can measure. Their proposals kind of go towards that. But you can call on people. Or you want?
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I'm a student at Georgetown, and I work at the Berkley Center. And my question is, so it's kind of related to what you were talking about. In terms of breaking down barriers and like creating equal privilege, do you think that that's feasible with like our current economic system? Like, and considering how like because of like the long history of racism, it's so like social discrimination, racial discrimination is so embedded into like class discrimination. How do we like reconcile those issues? Like, how can we move forward in terms of like social progress without like addressing class issues?
We can't. I'm glad you're going to do that. I don't mean that to just be flippant, but absolutely, we need your generation to recognize that we can't continue on the kind of economic system and actually make it and so that even the civil rights dream of everyone being able to work for their own aspirations, because one of the real barriers is the very structure that you're talking about, and addressing that structure. And yeah, good. Figure it out. It's a hard one, but you really need to. Yeah.
My name is Lara, and I came to this through the Quaker meeting that I attend. They made me aware of it. But anyway, I have a thought about how to maybe address this problem, and I was just wondering if you think it would be helpful and whether you think it is at all realistic. What it is that my dad grew up in a white suburb of Chicago in the 20s and 30s, and then when when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, he was in ROTC beginning his first year of university, and the day after Pearl Harbor, he was in the Army because he was immediately drafted as a member of ROTC. And that was the hugest learning experience he'd ever had, was suddenly living with and working with people from all over the country. And I just can't help but think that maybe like a national, like 9 months of national service a year after high school, so people could still work for the summer and everything. I mean, people would have different spending money and stuff. It obviously wouldn't be perfect system at all, but I mean, I just wonder if something like that could jumpstart people learning about other cultures and stuff.
I think it's a fantastic idea. How many people think that's a fantastic idea? See, you've got lots of support here. I think that'd be a great step in the right direction, and to make it a draft of community service.
And just make it really educational, and make have it be obvious that that's one of the goals of it. Is that? Because I mean, for him, I could just tell when he lit up, it was fascinating for him.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be a fascinating experience.
There is an initiative. It's called like Year to Serve. Like the Aspen Institute had a presentation on that, and it was a former government official that was wanting to start it. So, and it was not just for young people. It was for all Americans to do it. Catherine, had you?
Catherine Marshall from the Berkley Center. You worked in the Department of Education, and you seem pretty skeptical about the KIPP schools.
Yeah.
So I'm curious as to, do you have a model that something that really does seem to work well in terms of the education? We all know that education is the answer. So.
Yeah, right. The freedom schools that are not schools but are after-school programs are a serious, good attempt in that direction. I think there's still one operating in Minneapolis. Native Americans set up survival schools, they call them. The schools that are sponsored, kind of inspired by Montessori, often have that sort of approach. I mean, I just took them because many people have heard of KIPP schools, but I agree with what Arnie Duncan often said. Charter schools, public schools, private schools, the issue is to have good schools, and that those categories aren't useful. The usual categories that are used to describe schools are not very useful in determining whether they're good schools or even harmful schools. So, I think there's hope that people are doing similar. Catholic schools come in all kinds in this same way. When I talk to graduates of the Cristo Rey schools, for example, they often tell me about that their experience there of being out in the world and their expanded horizons where they were accepted was an empowering. And there's some diocesan schools that I wouldn't put in the same category, but that's all opinion. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Maggie Johnson. I'm a business owner in Montgomery County. I have a translation company, and I have a great privilege of seeing all kinds of humanity come to me all week long, day after day. And I'm also a sociologist, and I'm also writing a memoir on growing up in a racially segregated town in southeast Texas. And at the time, our high school integrated in 1982, and we were told, doing my research now, I know it's not true, but at the time we were told we were the last high school in America to integrate. So anyway, one thing I want to approach too is bringing white people on board with this project. And one thing I've been thinking about, this whole idea of tribes, and also I was talking to my son about the book. I was talking about black, white. My son's 14 years old. He says, "Mom, white is not a race. It's a social construct."
All right.
And I didn't teach him that. Yeah. So, and I'm thinking, I'm a sociologist. Did you forget? But anyway.
Shame on you.
But he's like, white is a social construct. And this is something that I've been thinking about, this kind of like tribe issue. So, we have this crazy white supremacist group talking about they want to preserve being white. And you're talking about the patchwork of America. And we have to remember that. And also I hear like really unhelpful rhetoric coming from the left, the progressives, about, white people need to stop doing this, or why are white people doing this? Because we have white supremacy exist in our institutions. Like, even if all the white people went away, it's still like or there were only a handful. It's in our institutions, and this exists separately from individual action. And I think that it might be helpful if we also include in the discussion that white people gave something up in favor of being called white people, because it is a social construct. And you can even look, we have a whole series of legal cases constructing whiteness in our country because white people had certain privileges. And, Arab Americans claiming that we're white. There are a lot of court cases about this. We gave up our ethnicity, our ancestral heritage, whether Scottish, Irish, Italian, whatever, in favor of having this privileged position in society of being white. And, not totally, but to a very large extent. And I just think that might be useful, or an entry point for some people to think about, that this is something we gave up in order to have a privileged position in society.
I couldn't agree with you more. Right after my wife and I got married in 1970, I was going to graduate school at NYU, and we moved into the Park Slope neighborhood of Brooklyn into a tenement house. We were on the third floor of a tenement, and we're moving in. We were just married. We came in a taxi. My wife had a trunk with her belongings in it. I had a box and 2 suitcases. That's what we owned, moving into a furnished tenement there. And as the taxi is unloading, obviously, the Polish women in the neighborhood who were on the second and third floor looking out their windows, watching, and a woman who I later got to know is looking down from across the street, looking down at us, and she calls out to me. She said, "Hey, Sonny, are you Polish?" And I said, "No." I said, "Oh, are you Italian?" I said, "No." She goes, "Well, what are you anyway?" Well, to your point, I was lost. I had no idea what I was. And it's tragic because I grew up in Iowa. I was white. I'd given up any kind of identity. I didn't, and I think to your point is extremely important that has, and that's part of one of the things that white people can do is to reclaim an identity. Yeah.
I'm Greg Mize. I'm a trial judge here in Washington and teach at the Georgetown Law Center. And I'm reminded of, well, first, thank you for your presentation and the book that you worked so hard on. I'm reminded of the line in A Tale of Two Cities, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. And it's very difficult to be thinking this is the best of times right now as the impact of media on our society. My children and their friends are always looking at a device in their palm of their hand, and there's the political gerrymandering of the political system where it's a sure bet the same people will be reelected in the near future, so the system doesn't look like it's going to change. Having done your work, I mean, do you have a perspective about how this could be the best of times? Because it's very difficult to see.
It is difficult to see, and I find my reason for not just going into complete despair in the examples of things where I see people are, and I don't want to call it experimenting, they're really working out how to be multiracial families, where there are organizations like Virginia Organizing that I describe in the book of multiracial leadership, really working on trying to work together for the betterment of others as well as themselves, and that there are while the best of times would be a stretch. For me, the fact that there's this many people that just want to share, and the quality of discussion that we've had here. I see. I'm not ready to say it gives me hope. It keeps me from despair.
Just to add to Maggie's point, there's a rabbi here in Washington, D.C., Rabbi Gil Steinlauf, who wrote a really powerful piece in the Washington Post arguing that Jews are not, in fact, white and should not claim the identity white, but they should only claim the identity as Jews who are bound by their religion to fight for justice on behalf of the oppressed, in the concept of tikkun olam, healing the world. So it's a really fascinating piece. So if you're interested in that idea, I'd encourage you to read it. So thanks for bringing that up.
About people getting to know each other. I had this experience. The Washington Hebrew congregation had an interfaith service for Catholics, Muslims, and Jews, and then they had a dinner. And the rabbi there, and what was so remarkable is that there was no lecturing or consulting or anything. Gave each of the faith groups a color. Blue, gold, and white. And then when you went to sit down for dinner, the napkins were blue, gold, and white and alternated. And he just said, you go and find your color on the table and sit down. End of discussion. But to me, that was the most, at the end of that dinner, it was the most powerful experience. I came away like, there's no difference between any of us.
Yeah.
You know, supposedly these are three groups that are battling each other. But by the end of that dinner, I said, we discussed things and ideas and all kinds of stuff, and there was really no difference among any of us. And I thought that rabbi was so brilliant that he could do this without any lecturing or any comments and stuff. And I just felt that if there's some way to do this exposure inclusiveness, rather than just lecturing or telling people what to do, it would be so much more powerful. And I thought we always have to, psychologically, we have to have somebody that we're better than. And I think that has ended up being color. And how can we get over that then? How do we get over that?
Well, that's we're not going to have time to really do that question, but I have a suspicion that the getting over it has to do with the contribution that the interfaith groups have to bring to this. I know of no faith that claims that in its pure and fundamental form there are faiths. There are people who have misused faiths, but in their pure form, that don't claim the unity of all humanity and reject a hierarchical approach. And I think that ultimately that's just one that has to come from that source. Otherwise, where else is it going to come from?
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation and this discussion. But my name's Sarah. I'm a student at Georgetown, and I also work at the Berkley Center. And I kind of wanted to go back to the previous comment about, I'm sorry if my wording's a little off here, but about whiteness kind of taking over previous identities. And if we're looking at that topic and that subject, and maybe how do we, if white is a social construct, maybe going back to those kinds of identities and finding a non-social construct if humans need a way to define themselves. But from conversations I've had with some of my Black friends who don't even have that option, who come from one of my friends was, I'm Black and I have no idea where my family's from because my family was taken here as slaves and they don't know where they're from. And so if we're looking at that from white as a social construct, well, we have other things to fall on. How do we look at that from Black also being a social construct, but how do you get to where someone's from or like what their ethnicity is? And I guess that kind of idea.
Yeah. Wow, good question. I think that it's dangerous. The logical and I think accurate implication of your question is that both, to go back to the genetic thing, genetics can't be the only source of our identity. And in the same way, you can think of geography as being the only source of our identity. And in finding identity, that it is a personal. Ultimately, that's what it is. It's individual identity, but it's in the context of a group constructing that and knowing that and making choices. And that I think of, I have several nieces who were adopted from other countries, and their parents are white. And they have a choice of kind of thinking about, are they going to pursue the family that they grew up in, the identity of or are they going to look at the identity of their genetic identity, or at least the source where they were born? And that, so your question is complex because it is complex. And that ultimately it becomes racist to say that you have to make your identity on the birthplace of your ancestors. That's part of the white paradigm and part of what supports the whiteness paradigm is put everyone else who isn't white into some other category like that. So I think it's a good and important question.
Hi, my name is Andrea. I'm also an undergraduate student in the SFS at Georgetown. I had a question about the anecdote that you gave earlier about your child versus someone who's maybe of African American origin and the wealth that they would accumulate in 35 years.
Yeah.
So my question is, in order for that to change and for people who are not white to be able to kind of, for the system to be more equitable, does that require the people who have the privilege to give up some of it? And is it kind of like, because economics is a kind of a zero-sum game, is there gonna have to be white people who have a lot of like accumulated wealth to like actually choose to forfeit that wealth? Yeah. And how is that a necessity, and how is that gonna happen?
Yeah, wow. Melody, how do you have such clever students at your, all of them with great questions? So the short answer to that question is that the United States, if we're talking about American racism and the American economy, the United States of America has more than sufficient economic resources for every American to have a fulfilling life that is not threatened by poverty or unnecessary disease. Period. Why don't we do that? Okay? That is ultimately that's where we have to start when we're thinking about about economic justice and what's happening, is that to start with, it may be a zero-sum game, but at this point, there's more than enough to go around. And that the issue then of solving that is to make sure that the results of the fact that in this century the results of the increase in productivity of the American economy have all gone to less than 1% of the American population is where the issue lies. And so when we're talking about making economic racial justice, we have to say, okay, there's plenty of money to do that. That isn't the problem. There's plenty of resources. We can do that. So so I'm responding that way because very often the way that question is for particularly the 99% of the white people who are in the 99%. Think, oh, this, if we have justice, economic justice, then that means my kids aren't going to have an advantage, or the white kids aren't going to be able to do as well. Or there's absolutely no reason for white coal miners to worry about that if we have racial economic justice, that they have to be the ones to suffer. That's just silly because it's where the wealth, there's plenty of money in the bank to make it, and so that there's economic justice. Now, so the short answer is no. In order to make it and so that every American can have a fulfilled life without unnecessary health issues is within our grasp, within the resources that we have. I think that there are places in the world with such a large population and a less developed economy that's much harder. And that's something we should think about too in terms of the global justice of that. But that if the United States decided to do that tomorrow, when they fix the tax law, they could fix the tax law, and so that we're moving in the right direction. I got a little emotional there, did I? Yeah.
Thank you again for coming in. My name is Luke Brown. I'm a Master's of English student here and another student worker at the Berkley Center.
All right.
My question for you is actually geared towards Georgetown, where we're
Okay.
holding this discussion today.
Yeah.
Are there any racist policies, procedures that you would want to call our attention to that are currently operating at Georgetown, perhaps that we don't often think of as a form of white supremacy,
Yeah.
or in higher education more generally?
Yeah. My general, I think I want to respond to that this way. I was 2 weeks ago, I was at the Association for the Study of Black History and Life convention that was in Cincinnati, Ohio. And there was a presentation about higher education from a researcher in higher education who was talking about the problem of the lower graduation rate of non-whites across higher education, and the issue of the failure of higher education to graduate students of color at the same rates that they graduate white students at every level, community college, across the board. And so in the discussion time, I said, well, Georgetown has a program that Alberto Morales was directed for a while, and I talked to him a couple of years ago, where students, mostly students of color, but they also included white students, have the opportunity of talking to him when the economic situation is making it difficult for them to stay in school, that they have to get an apartment 10 miles from school, and their car breaks down, and they don't have the $500 to fix their car, and they can't get to school, and they have to drop out and get a job because they don't have any other alternative, or the grandmother dies in California, they've got enough money to fly out, but they're not going to be able to come back to school because they don't have enough money to buy a return ticket, and that the program was working with those students and, when necessary, helping them with the actual money so that they could get their car fixed or they could get a ticket to fly back. And so I described that, and then I said, and the results of that is that Georgetown has a graduation rate of the poor students and of the non-white students that's as good or better than of the white students. And the response to that sort of surprised me, because I said, well, so why don't across higher education, why don't we just fix that? That seems reasonably easy. The response to that was, well, that's good, but a lot of the work that schools are doing in order to raise the graduation rate of non-white students is just to raise the graduation rate, but not to make the non-white communities full participants in what's happening at the institution. And that the school may be able to figure out how to buy the graduation rate with, and therefore avoid dealing with the question of whether there is really full whether the university, now to use my language, whether the university is really a patchwork institution of full participation of all groups. I don't know how to apply that specifically to Georgetown, but I think that it is a challenge of every institution of higher education to really look at where the faculty is. What are the subjects really relevant? What are the, that it's more complicated than just getting students through.
Hi, thank you for coming. My name is Austin. I am I'm a student in the School of Foreign Service here. I'm a sophomore, and I've been thinking about this issue a lot recently in terms of personal psychology instead of from a social or societal standpoint. And I've noticed in my own, doing observations on my own thoughts, that when, in comparison between before I knew a lot of these data points or these realities about my own society regarding racial injustice or racial segregation, and after, the incidence of accidental, racist thoughts in my head that I have to quell didn't change. And the reason, and so my thought was that this helped me manage those better and change my behavior in ways that reflected the way that I want to see society change, but it didn't help my natural, accidental, incidental thoughts change. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how we access more of a core psychology with people that produces some of these results instead of just, making people aware and having their behavior change.
Yeah, that fascinating question. And I really don't know very much about it, but one of the things I ran across when I was reading in the library here at Georgetown was that there's some people who are doing brain research on that they look at how the brain, that one of the things that they've been able to identify when they do these brain things is that they can see the place in our brains where when we're in an uncomfortable or in a racial situation that it fires or that there's activity there or something. And they were able to identify, the way I understand the research, they were able to identify when there was a kind of positive and a negative activity. And then over time, what they saw was that there are actually changes in people's brains, and so that they that those racist the natural, and I don't think it's natural, it's learned, the things that are there at first, disappear or become less. So from that, I take from that some hope that if you and I continue to take seriously the outer actions and the kind of conscious dealing, that in fact our brains will come along with us. That's what the brains, what they say. Now, I don't know very much about that research. I just read a few papers about it, and that's what I understood from it, that we aren't completely victims of some kind of inner racism that gets caught in our brain and we can never lose it. So I hope it's true.
Just got a few minutes. Yeah.
This is exactly what I'm writing about in my book, what you just described, because I went through the same experience when I was about your age, when I was at university, and I would just like to second what Professor Ken said here, is that if you keep doing this, you will find those racist thoughts that come up. They're going to get less, and eventually they're going to go away. And totally, yes, it can change, but this is like so key to bring awareness, that process. Yeah.
Let me take the last two questions, and hopefully you can combine them.
Okay.
So I have a question about the dream itself, the civil rights dream, because often in racial justice discussions, there's two almost like competing visions, and there's a lot of tension between these different dreams. So one dream is the dream of like equal opportunity, where everyone, faces either the same barriers or the same, or like, no one faces any extra barriers from anyone else in achieving what they try to achieve. Yeah. And then the other vision is more of a restorative justice to sort of correct real historical wrongs that have happened to certain communities, collectively. And so the first question is, would you say that you're more sympathetic to the dream of equal opportunity for all, or do you think that in order to get there, it's more necessary to sort of create this restorative justice where communities who have been collectively punished, unjustly punished, sort of get something to, create some justice? And then the second part is, if you believe in this vision of restorative justice, then how would you go about thinking about who is responsible? Who is a responsible party and who is an indebted party? Who is the wronged party? So for instance, like, if you think that special programs should be made specifically to aid African Americans since they've had a legacy of racism and things like that, then would you say that only white people should pay for these programs? Or would you say that white people or just non-black people generally, so white people, Hispanic people, Asian people, they should all pay for these programs? Or would it just be a wealth thing, just wealthy people, even including wealthy black people? Should wealthy black people pay for these programs along with wealthy white people and wealthy Asians and things like that? How would you go about thinking about who's responsible and who's an indebted party?
Yeah, good question.
Thank you, Ken Dante. I'm just going to think a little more international, and I'm thinking about tribalism.
Yeah.
And so we have these lovely ideals about kind of a universality of things, but more and more we're seeing things break down to tribal units. We're seeing ethnic cleansing in many different countries. Yeah. We're seeing fear, and you're talking about distributing economics, but I'm going to talk about distributing power. I'm going to be a little bit more like an Adlerian.
Yeah.
Do you trust that other group to have power, given the fact that they may have done these grievous acts in the past, or we're afraid of their vengeance in the future? Do I really want to give them political power? I'm being cynical here. Do I really want to give them political power? Can I really trust them? Or is this just this idealistic, very nice thing, but when push comes to shove, can I trust them? I'm thinking about the Middle East. I'm Jewish by background. And this Jewish universalism, and then this kind of Jewish blood ethnic stuff. And if I look at Israel, Palestine, it's like, can we really trust these people? I mean, could you really afford that nice universal stuff? When you turn your back, they're going to get you. So we struggle with these two qualities. So I'm not siding with one or the other. I'm just
those are about the same question, I think, in many ways. But and if you would all be amazed if I actually had the answer to that, and I wish I could just amaze you. But I think we need to, in some ways, put aside the recognize that what we're talking about in establishing a patchwork quilt nation or a patchwork quilt world is not something that is easy, and that I would argue that it probably won't be very helpful to start from the position of blame, which is why I'd like to start from the position of gifts and to not think of, now, then the question becomes where, so there is already a very clear power structure, and so then we're talking about a shifting in power, and I think that that becomes the place where, again, I don't know any way that we can move ahead on that except to look at all of the faith traditions, all of the ancient faith traditions. Reject a personal seeking of and abuses of power. I mean, that's that all of them look at living for others, a concern for others, looking out, not putting self first, and that that ultimately the answers to both of your questions are to start not from the kind of power perspective, how are we going to trade off power, who's going to, but how do we find the undergirding of living for each other and living in human community for that, then we all, then it isn't who are we going to take power from, but how are we going to share with each other. That's the best I can do. That's, let's all keep working on it, shall we? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ken. His email address is there. Stay in touch, continue the conversation. We hope to see you at future Berkley Center events. Thank you to all the students and colleagues who've joined us today. And let's all give Reverend Dr. Ken a hand.
Thank all of you.